Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, 26 months after the Alberton chemical spill, ATSTR released the results of their initial health survey. Later that summer, in conjunction with a fundraiser for ACCEH, Lucinda Hodges released public information about safety problems on MRL's rail line. Within weeks, her husband was brutally attacked. We now begin Part 4, Light at the End of the Tunnel, with Chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1, The Watchdog. As an outsider, more than anyone, Lisa Mosca took on this X-file. In late 1998, she dropped in at the D.C. office of the National EPA Ombudsman Robert Martin, a busy mobile man who happened to be in that day. Martin's job was to listen to citizens' complaints about Superfund sites. Mosca beseeched him to consider Alberton. Despite years of victims voicing frustration, no one mentioned recourse to the Ombudsman. In January 1999, ACCEH formally petitioned Martin. They requested a site visit and a meeting with spill victims, along with a review of response decisions. At this point, many victims are desperate, ACCEH wrote. They have not received adequate medical care. To this day, many doctors refuse to discuss medical concerns related to all but classic chlorine respiratory symptoms. Many victims became so chemically sensitized after the spill that they had to move away from Alberton, they wrote. Hopeful, Lucinda Hodges remained a seasoned cynic. Here we go again. That winter, Hodges went to a hearing in Kellogg, Idaho, held by the Ombudsman on the EPA's involvement at the Bunker Hill mining site. Hodges wanted to see this man in action. Before I even talked to Bob, I just watched him, she said. Hodges was impressed by his impartiality and professionalism and his swift decision-making. He hadn't accepted her petition yet, but Hodges talked to him later that evening and gave him Mosca's film. A member of the Makah tribe of Washington, Martin was a large man with a friendly demeanor and ponytail. People called him the Ghost because he eschewed interviews. ACCEH sent copies of their petition to Montana's congressmen, asking them to support the investigation and requested they meet with victims so they could air their concerns. As a follow-up, Hodges and Mosca again visited Washington, D.C. that March. Only Senator Max Baucus's staff called Martin to talk. Barbara Rogers, Baucus's Public Works and Environment Committee aide, knew Martin. The effort soon paid off, as Baucus sent Martin a letter supporting an independent review. To Hodges, the letter was gold. Bob Martin arrived in Missoula on May 4, 1999, and met with Hodges, Roger and Ada Chalmers, Beverly Ridenour, Roxanne Zymet, Katina Madge, and Hope Seek in the sunken lobby of the Parkside Holiday Inn. Glenda Giles came to town to attend as well. Martin had been the National EPA Ombudsman for 6.5 years. I've said in many places that I didn't know what I was getting into when I took it, and they didn't know what they were getting into when they let me in, Martin said of his job. Amiable, soft-spoken, and succinct, Martin smiled with set lips and nodded his head affirmatively to his listeners, one of his mannerisms. The good news, since meeting with Hodges in Bunker Hill, he decided to open an Alberton investigation. The confirmation brought out smiles. Comprised of a staff of 4, the EPA Ombudsman Office received about 4,000 complaints a year. Martin divided responses into cases and matters. Matters were resolved in a day or a week, but complex situations became cases and could take years. Right now, he had about 24 cases. Alberton was going to be a case. In the past, he said, he'd had incinerators taken down and areas completely retested. Some of my cases and formal reports have resulted in criminal grand juries at the federal level, he said, so it can get quite serious. Roger Chalmers, I think we're going to end up there. Martin, my life's been threatened in California for doing a case. Giles, I was going to say, you're not very popular, are you? Martin, well, depends who you ask. Everyone laughed. Martin complimented the group on the efforts they'd made to date. First of all, your work's commendable, all the research you've done. I'm sorry you had to do it, and I'm sure you're sorry you had to do it. To do such a good job with this. I'm sorry it happened. Hodges, that says it. Hodges' scant words harbored deep emotion. An official had recognized the effort they'd made and apologized for their having to do it. The group spent over 2 hours relating personal stories and general concerns to Martin, who listened closely. Hodges was beside herself. A new beginning. Martin, what I usually ask folks right up front is, what do you want? Hodges, well, I made a list. All laughed as Hodges handed a 17-point list to Martin. Martin, normally when I do this, I always go out to the site. Normally I have people who ask me to come in, take me, show me what they want me to see. Now, there's different issues about that. Some of you guys can't go anywhere near there. Chalmers, none of us can without having a reaction. Hope Seek offered to take Martin to the site the next morning. Chalmers explained to Martin why he thought there had been a cover-up as to what was on the train, what had spilled, alleged buried cars, and how everything had been reported. Martin brought up the EPA not being allowed on site the first 3 days. He made it clear that the EPA had jurisdiction. The group talked about the lack of decontamination, the effects beyond the evacuation zone, the animal rescues that made people sick, and told Martin about the Cressley car being brought to Missoula, which had made some Northside Missoulians ill. Madge, the thing that's so terrible about this thing, we all have such unique experiences, symptoms that are unique to each person. And a lot of us really thought we were crazy for a long time. Martin, you're not crazy. Madge, we know that now. We know that now. Madge sounded relieved to hear Martin say it. As the stories poured out, Madge asked Martin if he was overwhelmed yet. Martin, I was overwhelmed 6 years ago. Seek asked about the process Martin would undertake. He said next he would visit the site. Then they initiate fact-finding, okay? It seems to me here there's a whole hell of a lot that needs to be known that's not known right now. Hodges, we just have 1,000 unanswered questions. Martin did not have subpoena power, but he'd never been turned down for information requests. Martin said the process can take anywhere from months to 2 years. Madge, well, Lucinda and I have pretty much decided that we're in it for the long haul, right? Martin asked if anyone had requested permanent relocation. Hodges, we begged. Ada Chalmers, they begged to ATSDR and EPA. Hodges, we have to look to the corporation. Martin, I would think they would be reluctant to pay the cost of relocation, not because they're afraid to bear those costs. They'd rather not bear anything in the scheme of things, but it's an admission, back to, liability, personal injury. Martin explained that if they formally asked for relocation and were accepted, the government would buy out the house and property. He reiterated that Barbara Rogers said Senator Baucus wanted to be helpful. They talked about the CAG and the newly proposed EPA testing, which ACCEH wanted to put off until Martin had investigated. They talked about the settlement process with MRL that pit neighbor against neighbor for paltry amounts. Hodges, but basically there's a million stories like that. There was never any equity in how people were treated. Some people were offered $100, others way more. They talked about past and impending home foreclosures, then shifted to complaints about local medical care and diagnoses. As the meeting wrapped up, Roxanne Ziman concluded, I know there are more people out there and are having trouble, and either don't know why or are afraid to say anything because there's been so much division forced between everyone. And I'm just concerned about everybody. I'm finding more people at 6 Mile who are having problems, and it's sad. After 2 hours, everyone thanked Martin as they rose from their chairs in the hotel lobby. You're our last hope, Hodges laughed nervously. No government official had taken the time to listen to a group of Alberton victims speak at such length. Their outpouring undoubtedly seemed scattered and inundating to Martin, but he was used to this initial unburdening. And unlike when victims talked to skeptics, Martin listened objectively and sympathetically, and with an experienced ear. Most importantly, he had the power to initiate an investigation to gather answers. Martin seemed a godsend. The next morning, Seek drove Martin out to Alberton and met up with Kurt McComb at the Natural Pier Bridge. The site of the tumultuous lethal crash 3 years earlier seemed nondescript. Between the river embankment and the tracks lay a treeless patch of ground with foot-high grass and weeds, though a few spots were markedly barren. Green cottonwoods flourished in the area, though perhaps a dozen of the pines and Douglas firs along the high riverbank appeared dead. The May day was 50s mild and sporadically sunny. A sweet chemical smell, pesticide-like, greeted everyone. Not overwhelming, but pungent. "Oh yeah," Martin said, surveying the site. "I smell it." 3 years passed. In the field, McComb began explaining his immediate symptoms to Martin, gesticulating as a westbound train approached, its clatter drowning out his voice. As the MRL train arced the curve, its roar deafened. Despite the remediation, McComb said that the summer after the spill, he saw a black substance oozing up in the field. "They dug that, and you still saw months later this black stuff coming up?" Martin asked. "Yeah, this might be it right here, some places where the grass didn't grow back," McComb said. McComb pointed to a nearby bald spot about 5 feet wide. He pointed to other larger spots. "The smell greatly lessened during the 1996-97 winter," he said. McComb made a face. "I can still taste that stuff." "The smell was worse on the other side of the tracks in the south ditch," McComb said. "I'm really concerned that the EPA didn't get in till the 4th day," Seek said, "because immediately the railroad started berming and ripping up rail and moving stuff. They didn't let the FRA or NTSB in either till then. So a lot of stuff happened on site before anyone actually saw it." "Well, some people have made the analogy to a crime scene, you know," Martin told her. "Would you let an alleged murderer go to a crime scene and monkey with it for a few days and then take evidence?" "With the abetting of local and state officials, no less." Shortly later, Martin nodded. "You know, I feel it in my nose," he said. "I've got it big time in my throat," McComb said. He was sensitized. "It's all the way down to here now," indicating the top notch in his sternum. "I get it from time to time. Well, I get it from following a diesel truck now." Martin suggested they leave, but McComb wanted to show him the ditch that had held the cressolate. It too had been reseeded. As they crossed back over the tracks a minute later, Martin suggestively said, "Okay." "Yeah, I'm short of breath," McComb agreed. "That's why I don't come out here." No one from the government had asked residents questions about their chemical sensitivity or autoimmune problems, Seek told Martin as they left. Back at the cars, McComb explained that he generally felt safe 2 miles to the west at his home, but if he felt short of breath in the morning, he knew the wind had blown from the east overnight. Today, after 20 minutes at the site, McComb had to leave. Now. "I was concerned not to stay too long," Martin explained to Seek as they drove to Alberton. "It started to really get to him, worked its way up to about here." Martin's hand chopped at his neck, indicating location and effect. "When it gets to here, he's got to go." Martin thought there were a surprising number of people living in proximity to the site. "And there's still a pungent odor emanating from the soils adjacent to the tracks," he said, "despite the temperature not being high, which allows for more volatilization." "Yeah, you smell it." Seek next took Martin to the parking lot of the elementary school where they met Paul Lodge, a second-grade teacher well respected in the community. Lodge talked at length, explaining the difficulty he had breathing while sleeping on his back now, and his struggle over forgetting students' names. On the way back to Missoula, Seek laid out the main concerns for victims, that whatever they'd been exposed to, they'd suffered not just the initial exposure, but re-exposure during animal visits and then moving back into homes that clearly aggravated symptoms. They also suffered the soil being transported through town. And again, the EPA being kept off-site until the 4th day. Martin: "It's typical for the industry, for the affected industry, to be involved, sometimes in a leadership capacity. However, it's also typical for us," he laughed, "to be involved." This lockout puzzled him. Before he left Montana, Martin met with Seek and Hodges at the Chalmers home and spent hours looking over Roger's files and listening to his story, theories, and allegations. Among the spill victims, Chalmers particularly held Martin's ear this day, and Chalmers held many unique theories. The thrust of Chalmers' beliefs was of a widespread cover-up. Martin confided on the late-night drive back to Missoula, "This is going to be a nasty case." He faced much sifting to separate the wheat from the chaff. Robert J. Martin became Ombudsman for the EPA's Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response in 1992 at the age of 34. Classic ombudsmen like Martin were considered true watchdogs. An attorney by training, he never planned on working for the government. In the early 1980s, Martin practiced environmental law and represented Western Indian tribes. After that, he formed his own company, Nootka Environmental Systems, to clean up toxic waste on tribal lands. After this tort, policy, and remediation work, Martin spent a year with the Madison Group in Washington, D.C., working on environmental matters. During that time, Martin said, EPA contacted me about serving as ombudsman and pretty much gave me license to develop the function as I thought it should be developed, because they wanted a more dynamic ombudsman function. Previously, it might have been somnambulant, really sleepy. In addition to handling citizen complaints and helping industry comply with regulations, the ombudsman could influence EPA programs and decision-making. The ombudsman had no legal power to modify or reverse EPA decisions, but his role as a fair-minded mediator in an open arena exposed EPA machinations to public eyes. It made it hard to let bad decisions stick. I think I was in the job a week, Martin said, and I already had my first case. Investigations generally lasted 5 to 25 months, 13 months on average. Martin's official investigation began with a public hearing which clarified complaints. Mainly, he sought evidence to prove any allegations and accepted suggestions on potential solutions. Once an investigation was complete, he either wrote up a formal report made publicly available or made recommendations to the EPA and other agencies to address his findings. The rest was up to the EPA, who, Martin said, followed his recommendations 80 to 90% of the time. As Martin put it, the ombudsman function aims at truth and justice and fairness. Not surprisingly, exposing the truth made Martin enemies. Martin was often called the last hope by frustrated communities. Under Superfund law, once the EPA approved a cleanup plan or made its record of decision, the ROD, the plan could not be legally challenged by the public for 10 years, even through the courts. There was one exception. The EPA ombudsman could help unseal the deal by weighing in during the minimum 30-day comment period. After Martin became ombudsman in 1992, he tackled several cases across the country that resulted in changes in RODs made by the EPA, including removals of hazardous waste and relocation. When Martin told Alberton victims they didn't know what they were getting into when they let me in, he meant the EPA. No longer a paper watchdog, the ombudsman barked from the start. 2 weeks after he was hired, Martin heard complaints from a Pennsylvania community about EPA indifference. I used to think that the government mistreated only Indians, he was quoted in local papers. I now know they mistreat all Americans. The next day, an EPA official handed Martin a letter of retraction to sign. Martin refused. He'd spoken his truth. According to Martin, the more successful he became in helping address citizen grievances, the more resistance he incurred within the EPA. He felt a clear attempt to undermine him came with the 1995 EPA administrative creation of regional Superfund ombudsmen, who on average worked 20% of their time as ombudsman and 80% in EPA administration, an inherent conflict of interest. The regional ombudsman attempted to take over his cases. 10 lapdogs for the EPA. Martin simply refused to give up his cases. Meanwhile, ATSDR created their own national ombudsman in 1998. Frankly, Martin said, to shadow my cases. The attempt to control Martin concurred with more controversial investigations of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal in Denver, the Drake Incineration Project in Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, and the Times Beach Incineration Project in eastern Missouri. These investigations led to adoption of many operational safeguards for the incineration projects, Martin testified to Congress. In the Times Beach case, a federal criminal grand jury was convened as a result of Martin's investigation. Martin had been a dynamic ombudsman, receiving the Beyond the Headlines Award from the Project on Government Oversight in December 1998 at the behest of appreciative communities, among other awards. He was a true watchdog for the public interest. "I have no power," Martin has said. A civil servant, his recommendations were not edicts. But Martin wielded heavy influence through fact-finding and disclosures. "It wasn't about vengeance for EPA screw-ups," he said. "It's pursuit of the truth. But to get there, it gets pretty stormy sometimes." This was the dog Alberton spill victims had in their fight. But while Martin began to investigate Alberton, a major storm already brewed in Denver, Colorado. The Shattuck case, for Martin, was a paragon of the struggle for truth, justice, and fairness. This made Martin a target to be neutered once and for all. Chapter 2. Needs. By spring of 1999, 2 deadlines had passed for the CAG needs assessment. In April, Marchwick brought a draft to the CAG meeting and said he'd done it on his own time after Mineral County commissioners refused to allow him to work on it as an employee. "They strongly felt that I should be helping Mineral County residents only," he said. Ellen Leahy had cited 3 reasons for lack of Missoula County involvement: not feeling wanted, not having jurisdiction, and not having resources. Yet Mineral County was, quote, "third world poor," Paul Manson said. Though Leahy gave no input on the needs assessment, ATSDR later sent her a copy. "I remember looking at it," she recalled. "I don't remember what was in it." Roughly half of the people affected by the spill were Missoula County residents. Both counties should have been involved in this transboundary public health issue. Marchwick fired the graduate student that winter for ethical problems concerning her research. Marchwick, to his credit, accomplished what he did while being assailed from all sides. But ACCEH had repeatedly offered to help research or locate a student assistant. Petty politics had undermined the CAG from outside and within. Not surprisingly, the end result was a bare-bones report. Marchwick mainly examined the month following the spill because people questioned what they had been exposed to. He outlined the evacuation, remediation, soil testing, and air monitoring, the exposure pathways, the potential health impacts, and the ongoing community health concerns in 17 pages, with additional maps and sample data from the Olympus and EPA START reports. Marchwick noted with concern that many emergency responders lack protective equipment, the lack of a formal evacuation plan, and the exclusion of the EPA and Coast Guard from the hot zone for 3 days, which he did not investigate. Marchwick didn't address complaints of a pesticide smell away from the site. Marchwick now believed that humans exposed to chemicals could become sensitized, an indication of possible multiple chemical sensitivity, which he referenced several times in the needs assessment. "I think multiple chemical sensitivity does exist as a potential consequence following an acute toxic exposure," he told the CAG. No official involved with the Alberton spill had ever made much of the point publicly, if they even acknowledged MCS. However, in his written assessment, Marchwick withheld his personal opinions and wrote that MCS was controversial and that critics claimed the syndrome was psychological. There was no independent health survey conducted. Marchwick made no conclusions on whether any Alberton victims suffered from RADS or MCS. "I'm just producing facts," he said, yet calling his needs assessment a critique on the first month following the spill. But it wasn't an investigation. Marchwick hardly had time or resources to do one. This needs assessment was basically a summary and an outline as a critique of agency response. ACCH had accomplished much more years earlier. The implementation plan of the final needs assessment, released in August 1999, called for 1. A health evaluation, including a survey and medical exam. The CAG never performed the promised detailed survey long sought by ACCEH. ATSDR claimed the later health evaluation and the Phase 2 study on chronic illness met this need, despite many limitations. 2. Education on effective and specific evacuation procedures for the community, the media, local governments, and emergency personnel. It was unknown if there was any follow-through. 3. Further testing by EPA for remaining on-site and off-site contamination. More EPA testing was later done in 2001. 4. Testing of other sources of possible contaminants, such as the old roundhouse area and Alberton's water supply. Unrelated to the spill, the roundhouse area would be tested later by the EPA. The DEQ had already tested Alberton's water in April of 1999 and found no problems, though the water was allegedly heavily chlorinated. 5. Release of the Marine Environmental Air Monitoring data for SVOCs and VOCs. The Marine Environmental Summary Report finally became publicly available in June 1999. 6. Public and media education on multiple chemical sensitivity. It was unknown if there was any follow-through. And finally, there was no mention of medical care or financial help, the most pressing needs for ACCEH. The ACCEH board assailed the needs assessment as a summary with no new insight. Of paramount import, the health concerns of the community were not identified. Can or will ATSTR truly assist and provide for the needs of the community at this time and in the future, they asked. Lisa Mosca found the needs assessment deplorable, the CAG a waste of time. She commented, "The fault for the absolute and continuous lack of process, adequate scientific investigation, and overall assessment lies with ATSDR. Chemical exposure victims need treatment, not just studies," she wrote, all in caps. Exposure victims are not guinea pigs. They are truly suffering. I am very sad for the people of Alberton. The CAG rarely met again. Another $6,000 was supposed to go toward implementation of the needs assessment, but by 2000, Hodges hadn't a clue what was happening. Then in April 2001, Peggy Stevens of the Mineral County Health Department told Hodges she wanted to hold a public meeting concerning the NACCHO grant implementation money, which must be returned if not utilized by that June. Stevens, relatively new to the department, wanted ACCH input, but Stevens never met with Hodges, and Hodges never received word on how or whether the money was spent. Note, in 2015, the Mineral County Health Department did not reply to requests for information concerning implementation of the needs assessment plan by the county. The money was likely returned to NACCHO. Gary Weber offered a self-assessment of the CAG. Weber was co-chair with Marchwick. The purpose of the CAG, when it was set up, was to try and identify what had happened, he said, and try to formulate some sort of a plan for future disasters. I would say, on the whole, the CAG accomplished most of what it officially set out to. Apart from identifying any possible ongoing contamination, ACCH had wanted recognition of chronic illness and medical help for victims. Was Weber a believer in chronic illness from the spill? Though Weber claimed no chronic illness for himself, his daughter developed what appeared to be chemical sensitivity that affected her breathing. But Weber thought her problems were probably a little more psychological than anything for a while, he said. Weber claimed a friend of his was the only one I know with long-term problems from the spill. Weber knew Hodges and others who claimed illness, so the only one apparently referred to people he knew well and believed, but he did have a general opinion about ongoing health complaints. My impression is that the major portion of the community does not see there's been a lot of long-term problems, he said. Many would say, yeah, there are some individuals that have. I can guarantee you there exist people within the ones that are claiming long-term problems that are absolutely not believed by a very large majority of people in Alberton. The most vocal people who are claiming the long-term problems are probably the ones the majority of the people give the least credibility to. Weber's view hadn't changed since joining the CAG. This house sat in a pretty heavy portion of the original cloud, he said, referring to his home, and I've had minimal problems and minimal damage. His belief of inconsequential exposure was mainly rooted in his own lack of health problems. By extension, he questioned others' claims, except for his good friend's family who lived closer to the spill. ACCEH claimed that the CAG was out of touch regarding complaints of chronic illness. Marchwick hadn't lived in the area, and co-chair Weber generally appeared to be a disbeliever in chronic injury from the spill. Weber didn't recognize documentation of chronic illness as one of the purposes of the CAG. To Hodges, CAG members had failed to open their minds. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. In the summer of 1999, Dr. Kay Kilburn releases the results of his follow-up neurological testing, and ATSDR sponsors a one-time clinical evaluation for Alberton spill victims. That summer, 3 Alberton area mothers finally get a meeting with the Senator Max Baucus aide in Missoula, and while beseeching the senator's help, vent their anger and frustration. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.